It is my great honor tonight to introduce Mark Wormald. Mark Wormald has been fishing since the age of 4. First at a pool that his mother, a zoologist, showed him near their home. The catch ripples with reflections, so I'll mention via the catch that Hughes introduced his son Nicholas to fishing at that same age, 4 years old. And Nicholas went on to become a zoologist. This book, The Catch, like Hughes's work, is a song of praise to the lines of inheritance between poetry and knowledge of the natural world. Mark learned to cast a fly, age 17, when his father sent him on a course at the Arundel Arms in Devon, deep in what would turn out to be Ted Hughes' fishing country, where Hughes himself had raised a glass. Mark is an award-winning poet, having won the Newdigate Prize at Oxford, and later the E.C. Gregory Award from the Society of Authors. He is a fellow at Pembroke College, Cambridge, where his first office was the room where Ted Hughes dreamed of the burnt fox. Hughes was working on an English essay late into the small hours, fell asleep, and a burnt fox walked into the room, placed his bleeding, charred paw on the essay, and said, "Stop this. You're destroying us." If that fox is still roaming Pembroke College, you will be very pleased to discover this, which explores poetry by carrying poems, and the self too, back into the wilds and rivers that are the source of Hughes's book, River. Mark has edited 2 collections of essays about Ted Hughes, and widely published about Hughes in both top academic publications and fishing magazines. In 2019, he organized Owned by Everyone, the plight, poetry, and science of the salmon at Pembroke, an interdisciplinary conference that, in my mind, carried on Ted Hughes's legacy of conservation, insisting that enjoying fish, poetry, and mythologies of deep waters is inseparable from seeking to protect them and their creatures. Foxes fish themselves, so I think that if Hughes's fox is still about or has a Zoom account, he'll know what I mean when I say that reading The Catch taught me about how fishing was for Hughes, deep immersion in ecosystem, a point of contact with the natural world, sometimes a tumbling, rough, wild immersion. Mark's poet's eye transmutes years of archival research into this description of Hughes fishing on the Torridge. A touch, a trout, but then a big fish, salmon or sea trout crashes nearby in the river. I understand, as I never did before, what that action-packed writing of Iron Man might be inspired by. But as that fox knows, and this book demonstrates, just as often, immersion in ecosystem in fishing is a still point of contact, devoted observation, silence. The book is alert, as Hughes was, to the valences of silence, painful, inevitable, loss of contact, and then that regenerative, water-blessed sort. I learned, reading The Catch, that Hughes literally lost the ability to speak after fishing. So, the fishing diaries were where the words came back, The Catch tells us. That electric cycle between silence and words charges and suffuses Hughes's work. This gives me a new way of seeing that too. It's a story about what's underneath the surface. Underneath the silence, slowly rising, hauled up, or underneath the noise. How words come back, how creatures do. how memories do. Hughes's fishing diaries in mind and Hughes's book River in hand, Mark set out to fish in Hughes's footsteps. Robert Macfarlane calls The Catch time slipping and genre shifting. It's a tale of travel, wild places where travelers meet, sometimes across decades, journeys that are also returns. In one of my favorite scenes, Mark reads a poem aloud to the pool that inspired it, returns it to water. This is a wholly visceral version of words coming back. It's a literary biography, one of the most powerful tributes I've read to the non-human relationships that sustain, revive, accompany the self. A story about friendship, too, showing friendship was the matrix in which some of Hughes's most extraordinary work unfolded. And I think these are centers of gravity that are new to Ted Hughes literary biographies. It reminds us, scholars and fans, that stories about people, sometimes larger than life, can also be stories about a generation. It's a memoir in its own unclassifiable way. There's a real hunger right now, I think, for books that find that point of contact between poetry and the life. That fox roaming Pembroke is looking for that communion of inner and outer nature, poetry, the place where they meet. So are many people. This book gives us a new way of talking about Hughes's poetry, invites us to ask where Hughes's poetry might take us. In this traveler's tale, that question is often literal, blessing of wild places. For Hughes, fishing was a way of making contact with the self, too, in that vital flow, deepening, returning. What happens when that poetry makes contact with a life? And it's a book about fishing. But if The Catch shifts genres fluently as shape-shifting creatures in Hughes's poetry, that is embodiment of something elemental. The poems of River need their habitat. They can't be understood, not really, at a desk. They need to be fished for, released, grappled with, admired in place and in process, fishing. Stillness, struggle, contact with something wild beneath the surface, immersion in river presence. That's Hughes's phrase. Take this passage about Ted Hughes fishing. The stuff beneath his boot is wild, plunging, and at first he can't name it. It's a thing, black and sudden. He needs to stand in it, square, confront its force before it is river again. And if you're reading River, but are not waist deep in a Devon river, well, having read this, I know how fishing feels, looks. In these pages, Hughes's poems are river again. It catches that process, Hughes's process, gives it to us, to Hughes studies, while also inviting us into river presence, wherever we find it. Please welcome Mark Wormald.
Thank you so much, Kate. I really appreciate it. And I'm also extremely grateful to Aoine and Malcolm and Martin and Terry for joining us tonight. The Catch begins as a reading experience on the last Sunday in May 1983 on the River Torridge at dawn. But it also begins in the British Library and a startling first encounter with that May morning and the fish that Hughes contacts. And I'm going to call him Ted, contacts that morning. But I'm going to leave you to discover that first chapter. I'm going to begin reading in the second chapter. 2 months later, I teach, and term leaves time only for a couple more dashes to the station, the hour's train journey south, and delicious silent afternoons in the reading room of the British Library. But those are enough to whet the appetite and the hook that's already buried in me. I browse, discover so much more, not just in that leather-bound ledger, but in paper-clipped sheaves of small pages torn from reporters' notepads, in school exercise books. Some are in verse. Some have sketches, detailed illustrations. They're in some kind of order, but it's not obvious. And they're from all over the place: Iceland, Scotland, Devon. I discover whole 70-page accounts from Alaska, many more shorter tales of trips from Ireland. I reckon there are 1,000 pages in total, and they span the last 21 years of his life. Sometimes the paper's blotchy, rain, I guess, not tears, but there are other smudges, and sometimes to the point where you can't quite be sure what he was saying or writing. These same months, I've been fishing in print too. Selections of his letters have been published, and I discover in one he wrote to a friend in June 1980, just before the first of his Alaskan trips, and then in an interview he gave to a Canadian fishing magazine more than a decade after that morning by the Torridge, but published, like that letter, only after his death in October 1998, two versions of the same wondering truth. When he'd been fishing alone, as he had been that morning, he lost the power of forming words completely, sometimes for hours. Concentrated silence by the river left him physically unable to speak at all. He knew this was unusual. He'd heard or read nothing about this phenomenon anywhere else, he told that friend, but it intrigued him. In Iceland, he'd said, he'd even tried alternating between that wordlessness and the most immediate record of it he could find. So, and as Kate has said, the fishing diaries were where the words came back. And both the wordlessness and their return mattered more and was a matter of much more substantial mystery than for most of us who fish. Whether or not we have noticed the same thing in ourselves, I've never met anyone who has. We might justify an afternoon or evening by the river as a hobby, a break from our lives, from family, work, stress. The fisherman I've come to call my friend since that afternoon in the British Library know it's much more than that. But even if it is more, a plunge back into our childhood or into the hunter in us, a way of staring at and into the water in the hope of seeing things our day jobs have no time for, even a religion. Let's go church, one West Country sea trout specialist used to tell his friend on Sunday mornings, meaning the river. He told me this as we sat beside the Tor, where he'd just shown me lampreys at their writhing work in a shallow run above Umberley. Even if the break has been an act of worship in disguise, even if we keep fishing diaries of our own and look at them from time to time to remind ourselves of the odd great moment, or to arm ourselves with inspiration or the excuse to buy that new bit of kit in advance of the next trip, the moment of re-entry can be managed in the meantime. We split more or less easily back into our usual routines, our work clothes, meetings, desks. Who cares if we mumble a bit that first morning back, plead indulgence, blame any lingering incoherence on the long drive home the night before? But for this fisherman, the stakes were higher. Words were at least his living, even his life. And if they didn't come to him as he sat at the desk where he wrote, in a raised wooden hut in his big garden he climbed 3 steps to reach, he could hardly blame the commute. This stretch of the Torridge was only 20 minutes away, and her sister river, the Tor, flowed no more than 5 minutes' walk below the house. Or perhaps that was the problem. He knew the seductive dangers of this position. Never write anywhere near fishing, he'd tell a non-fishing writer. But he never left that house in the village above the river, and the words did come. And those he dealt in weren't just those of the fishing hand. He was a poet too, a poet first. Even in the essay he'd published just the week before that morning on the Torridge, on the country of the 2 rivers and their waters and their fish, you can sense it. A Tor flood can look like blood. And again, the most enthralling thing about Torridge and Soar sea trout night fishing is that the least touch can be anything from ½ pound to 7 or 8, which is like the difference between a swallow and a tiger. There is a weird kind of anticipatory terror about this, and it leaks an especially high quality adrenaline into the blood. which is no doubt the drug we are hooked on. If you don't fish, horrifying thought, if you're not one of us, you may think this looks like a deranged form of exaggeration. In fact, it's both understatement and afterthought, and something else too, prose afterglow of searing poetry. 4 years before, the author of these words had written a poem on a similar theme, the moment when, fishing one summer night for these wild creatures, he became aware they'd entered a pool on the river, on their journey back up their native rivers from the sea. It's called Night Arrival of Sea Trout. And now that moment of dangerous excitement doesn't just affect the something that leaps clear of the water, an upside down, buried heaven released into the world of air. Flowers become the creatures their names have always held. The dog rose, the foxglove, rediscovered their bellies, their touch. Even the honeysuckle has fangs. The lobworms couple. The stars in this strange summer night bite at the next snape. Earth itself begins to sing. And out in the cornfield by the river, something still more ancient, wilder. A horned god running and leaping with a bat in his drum. This wild energy was one he wanted to share. The poet had got his son, Nicholas, then 17, to print it. On an old offset press they kept in one of the outbuildings, named for an Irish goddess not quite as old as Pan. They printed it, sold it. The poet sent at least 2 proof copies as gifts to his new fishing friends, one of them also a poet. And now, 4 years on, Night Arrival of Sea Trout was about to appear again in a collection of poems I remember admiring sometime that year, 1983. I was 17 in 1983. Of course, I knew nothing about printing press or fishing diaries then, but I did love fish and already loved rivers more strongly and clearly than I then loved poetry, which is why I admired that book. It's no nonsense title, River. I remember handling it. It didn't resemble your usual collection of poems, and it was much more expensive. A glossy coffee table volume full of big landscape colour photographs, one facing each page of text. The photographs were by Peter Keane, the poems by Ted Hughes. I'd vaguely heard of him. I certainly didn't buy it at the time, much too expensive. But that one poem, Night Arrival of Sea Trout, caught my eye and more than my eye. That summer, we'd holidayed in Devon, staying in a self-catering annex of a posh fishing hotel, the Arundel Arms, where my parents had paid for me to go on a fly fishing course. I acquired the other skill that had got me into such trouble in the British Library that afternoon and taught myself to touch type. But of course, my main business was learning the real form of casting. I'd fished for years, but had only the vaguest notion of how to cast a fly. And though I'd had my share of tiddlers, it had been years since I'd connected with the one amazing solid trout of my life. As the mist swirled over a lake 2 hours after sunset, high in the Cardiganshire hills, the blind trout, my elder brothers had joked. This course in Devon was Dad taking me seriously, I thought. As well as teaching me the real rhythm of the cast by day, the instructors, Roy and David, took us sea trout fishing at night. Sea trout, genetically identical to resident river brown trout, who for some reason have gone out to sea in the coastal waters around the river mouths to feed, go strong and fast, return to their native rivers from late spring. They're notoriously shy fish, and you need to cast gently indeed to trick one into taking a fly by day. But by night, their wildness shines, as I discovered one unforgettable night that week. From a long, still pool under trees above a weir on the lid, a tributary of the Tamar, I didn't just touch one of these snarling, careering creatures, in truth, much more of a swallow than a tiger, which had truly given me the fright of my life when it snatched the fly I'd somehow flicked into the darkness, and moved me beyond words as 2 long minutes later, I brought that pale glimmer over my net. I also heard sea trout leap, sometimes apparently in concert for no reason I could think of except for the wild ancient joy of the night, up and down that pool. I heard the fins whir in the blackness, and sometimes through the leaf canopy, even saw them in their leaping catch and release the moonlight. I'd seen that upside down buried heaven, felt it. So River is the book I return to now, almost 30 years later, in the first months of 2012. In the weeks before and after that first afternoon in the British Library, I dip into it to test, so far as I can, the strength of the contact between the poet and the encounters I'm beginning to see he'd drawn those words from. On Rivers, I realise I may have fished myself. I read its poems, not in any particular order, and they take me back to the feel of that week as a teenager on the Tamar and its tributaries, moments I thought I'd forgotten. Shading your eyes and peering at afternoon deep into pools and convincing yourself that when Roy pointed out a grey shape, you saw the fish in it too. And not just that week, but in the days fishing I managed to eke from family holidays in the intervening decades. Once, when we had sons of our own, my wife and I rented a cottage for one August week by the West Lynn above Watersmeet on Exmoor, the northernmost of Devon's two wildernesses. The river bordered the garden, and under sunken tree roots right below my feet, I showed them something I dared not really believe I saw. A vast grey shape that really was a salmon. Wherever it had come from, it had certainly somehow left the falls and rapids further down the valley. It deserved the rest it may have been taking down below us, but it was sunk too, that fish, in something that looked, as I watched, like contemplation, so deep, 3 feet below the surface, that it made our own peering feel like an impertinence, even a violation. But here, in River, is just such a salmon, in the upside-down cage of a tree. And he, isn't just contemplating. If the sun's at the correct angle, and if you catch the right mid-morning moment, you can see the floor of his chapel. There he sways at the altar, a soul hovering in the incantation and the incense. It was reading these poems and feeling their rightness, not just for me, but for the fish in their pools, sensing that somehow these poems were doing them justice with a wondering precision that the photographs facing them now when I looked at them rarely did. It was revisiting River that made me begin, idly at first, to wonder where those pools lay, and the fish in them, and the insects that rose from them, and when the poet saw what he so evidently precisely did. One afternoon in March 2012, after gates opened for me in Devon, you'll have to buy the book to find out how, I stood there alone, implausibly reading Ted Hughes' diary entry of an entirely wordless encounter with a fish he never saw on this same stretch of river, self-consciously to myself, in the shallows at the tail of Concrete Ramp Pool, and loving it. And I realized something else about this presumptuous act of standing in his footsteps and imagining, hoping, adding words and physical sensation to a picture. It was something I'd missed or taken for granted somehow in the excitement of that afternoon at the British Library. What made that moment the most enthralling? Enthralling, the same word he'd used in his own essay on fishing these rivers for sea trout, of all his torrid fishing, wasn't just the moment of contact with that fish, that deep, strong take midstream. It was that he was standing in someone's footsteps too, when it happened. Someone he admired. That morning, trying to put himself in exactly the position to add the fish to the mysterious scale snagged in his flying treble hook, he'd fished for the first time in his life from where he recalled someone in a photograph in Torridge Fishery was standing. To have imagined casting from that same place and now to be doing it, and now to have that imagined moment so marvelously realized by a real contact with a real fish, that was what did it. Ted Hughes may have been a poet, but as a fisherman, he also read fishing books, fishing magazines, before he wrote for them, just like me. Reading his essay in the Arundel Arms that morning, I'd seen it. Torridge Fishery by Lemon Gray, or LRN Gray. Gray had favoured using yellow in the flies. Hughes credited Gray with it. Back at Rose Cottage that evening, I checked the online catalogue of the content of Ted Hughes's library, now in an American university. There it was. He owned a copy. I checked my own university library's catalogue. There Torridge Fishery was. The day after my return home, I became the first reader ever to borrow it. And there, in a black and white photograph, the author was too, casting from Island Run, just upstream of the rope footbridge he built across the river for his guests when he ran the Torridge Fishery of the title. There was more. Some weeks later, another trip to the British Library produced another catch. I noticed that early drafts of Strangers, his poem about sea trout, happened to be written on the back of a printed version of the hand-drawn map he'd given to Peter Keane. Why would he have had this printed? And then on a whim, thinking as a fisherman of the very few times when I'd paid for fishing, been given directions, I went back to the university library and flicked through copies of Trout and Salmon from the early 1980s. And there it was, in 3 successive numbers, March, April, and May 1982, a box advertisement offering salmon and sea trout fishing on a mile of the Torridge, part of Lemon Gray's old fishery. Accommodation was offered too, in a farm cottage, also to let, throughout the season, March to September. Contact details supplied, address and number. Apply Hughes, the advertisement told you, after 6 p.m. Ted Hughes was, by the early 1980s, reckoned by the critics I knew to be a shy, haunted giant of a man, a poet who sometimes shunned readings, who felt a dread of anticipation of heckling, barracking abuse. Yet here he was, publishing his address and telephone number, advertising the fishing he was in the months that box appeared, himself writing about. Why? Because this poet was also a fisherman who believed in the community of fishermen. He wanted them to apply Hughes. And when they didn't, he kept on trying. The book he'd spent 7 years on, refining, discarding everything that wasn't first intensity, wasn't, he discovered, finished with its publication. It was admired, yes, but not recognized for all he'd given it of himself. And he knew it was incomplete. Within a year, he told one non-fishing artist friend that it still lacked its central poem. It had its golden eggs, sure, but not the goose that laid them. He added angry poems about the pollution of the rivers he knew and loved best, the Torridge and the Tor. That poem with Charlie and Peter the corn farmer was called 1984 on the Tarka Trail, and he was aiming for the dark Orwellian tones. Other fishing poems followed from other trips further afield and found homes elsewhere. But when the chance came a decade after it had first appeared to republish it along with 2 other books that had begun as collaborations with artists or photographers, he'd made it his own. The poems now span 30 years. The notes he added, many more, but they also made the salmon its hero. A fine poet I know, Clive Wilmer, knew Ted Hughes. Clive visited him at Court Green 10 years after these advertisements appeared. And during a break in their conversation, when Hughes was called out of the room, he glanced at proofs of 2 of the poems that had first appeared in River and were now to appear in a new selection of his verse. Returning to the room, Hughes saw this and asked with a gruff, eager urgency, "Are you a fisherman?" He was, Clive told me, visibly deflated at the reply. Fishing is my way of breathing, Ted once told a girl I have come to know well in writing this book. She's about my age. She spent dusks and dawns with him and Nicholas and her own father, their close friend, in Ireland and in England. She knows he needed to fish. It sustained him. It took him into the natural world and reminded him of who he was, who he had been. It was his longest love affair. When the waters he loved were under threat, and as a farmer and countryman, he knew better than most how vulnerable the Torridge was, he was ready to speak publicly on oath in their defense. but he needed others to share it too. And he'd been trying for years before he came to river, years before he even thought of catching a salmon or sea trout, years before he moved to Devon. I just want to read, before pausing properly, 3 pages from a chapter on the sea trout, which I've already mentioned, because, not least because I think David, one of those instructors I've mentioned, David Pilkington, was absolutely sure, and David taught Ted to cast a fly for salmon a couple of years before he taught me to cast for trout. David was absolutely sure that the sea trout was Ted's favourite fish. Now, I'm not so sure, but I just want to stay with sea trout for a little bit longer. And this is from a chapter called Strangers, and you'll see why. I'm back at Rose Cottage above the Tamar. This time I've brought my rod. It's the May half-term holiday, and I've heard that the big sea trout have arrived, and Underhill, the best pool on the Tamar, is available. It's a warm night, and there's no moon. Good. Moonlight frames human profiles, scatters these wary fish. But I'm rusty and self-conscious. Casting a fly at night when you're excited or unsure can snarl your invisible line. I've climbed back out of the river and I'm fiddling on the bank near my car, head torch safely off the river. And then I hear a rumble. I extinguish my beam. A deeper darkness looms among the bank. And it's not a cow or a deer or any other creature of the night. A white pickup lights off and my heart sinks. Was I not meant to be here? Is it bailiff or poacher? I've been longing for this night. But then a friendly voice speaks out of the darkness, warm Devon. Hi, Mark, I'm Gerald. How are you getting on? John told me you like Ted Hughes. What's your favourite poem? Mine's October Salmon. And even as my mind reeled with wonder, the charm of it, I knew the answer. Strangers. In the British Library, there's a folder of Ted's poetic portraits. All but one is of people, and they go no further than sketches. But here's something different, an untitled group portrait in real time. 3 full pages of reporter's notebook, all verse. And for once, water conditions and light mean that he can sketch them. It's early June, mid-morning, spring side of midsummer. And the day's brightness probes the riverbed's gravels, picks out the shadowy forms of minnows and the big, heavy strangers, the sea trout in flotilla. Time is measured in slow light. Sun inches. The sea trout defy it. All day they embody night cool. All day, whether he's beside the river, watching damselflies emerge in all their metals, or back at home, Ted has them in his head. He revolves around their still centre. Wherever I walk today, they are there. Whatever I happen to be doing, they are there, watching, unmoving. But these 7 long ships, each one concentrated, like a shell in the breach, are full of the charge they've brought with them, power he knows he might just be able to provoke. At the end of this draft, they still struggle with their sea strength, ready to explode at the touch of steel. You can feel an August evening and after moonless midnight stirring in this portrait. And it's the closest the Torridge ever comes to the conditions Tom Rawling and Hugh Fulkus took for granted. Clear water when you can see the fish, measure them, have time to find and discard words that respond to the play of body and water and light and the mood these fish inspire in you at different times of day or night in different years. I suspect Ted wrote it about Sprackman's Pit before the waterboard hacked back those branches in 1980. Perhaps in 1979, when the memory of Rawling's other poems are fresh. Ted had praised them for the feeling they evoked of the hook's steel on tooth. Strangers is the poem in River that slow, day-long portrait in early June became. But it settles for the first moment, a brief encounter at dawn. There's no question now of taking these fish from the river. It's enough just to watch, wonder at these rare conditions. There they actually are, under homebody oaks. He won't have long before some false human step or clumsy movement on their skyline, his or a companion's, sends them scattering like the trout they themselves were before some sexual imperative to feed, breed silvered them at sea. It's enough to see the holy ones, the priests of that sea tribe. Ted concentrates, not now on their future in the autumn. That's too far off. He gives all he can to their attitude, their poise, their focus. He relishes the slight riffling of their tail ailerons, wants us to share it, feel it, say it aloud. As he'd known full well when he met the new owner of his fishing, it's not a raised voice that spooks them, but a clumsy step. Stillness helps him catch every detail of the river as it takes these sea tribes, strangers in. Using the word he'd have come across when he and Sylvia were in America, he notes water skeeters on their abacus. The buzzard's slow hand. It's wonderful. But above all, he concentrates on the sea trout. They ignore anyone or thing who watches them, targets them, the sun so openly aiming down, and looking up with a serenity that only Ted could have defined as he did. These extraordinary fish absorb everything and forget it into a blank of bliss. And this is the real samadhi, worldless, levitated. Samadhi is a state of superconsciousness. Ted owned a book by a Hindu spiritualist, Muni Sadhu, called Concentration. It's an essential rare stage on the path to self-realization, and it requires years of disciplined self-training. Ted had to explain it to the editors and critics who asked him what it meant. I stumbled across it in one of Ted's fishing notebooks, across lists of sea trout flies. The sea trout are emblems, exemplars of a consciousness he aspires to. The ultimate insiders in a vision of paradise only Ted was equipped to see. But I hope that gives you a sense of the movement between the diaries and why they matter, and the experience they arose from and the experiences they inspired in me, both in the archive but also on riverbanks, and the friends I've made doing it. The spelling of her name, somewhere between the goddess of Loch Gur, Anya, for whom its guardian Michael Quinlan had named a daughter, and the phonetic version Ted, that's Anya, A-I-N-E, and the phonetic version Ted used in his diaries, O-N-I-A, to describe this sweet kid they met on their return to Jer Point that April afternoon, and who then joined them on their long journey northwest to Arrow and Key, isn't the only unconventional thing about Anya. She may rhyme with her mother, another odd half rhyme. Anya and I were born only 2 months apart. She's the child of two artists, each so dedicated to their medium, so immersed in it, that she had to make her own way through her early years. And that meant being a child of the island too. The great old mill house beside the Nore, to which her parents moved just before Christmas 1965, within weeks of her birth. Almost at once, the Nore came to meet them. Sonia had told me of the floods that swept downstream, the first within days of their arrival. She'd had to caulk the floors and windows with river mud to keep the water out, but when it started spurting up between the floor tiles, they retreated upstairs with eggnog to ride out the storm. They floated paper boats on the waters lapping at the stairs. When the waters subsided, they found salmon caught in the netting in the rose garden. More than once, a pike took up temporary residence in the hall before moving to the kitchen. In that leak packing box of letters, Barry showed me a poem Seamus Heaney had sent him, The Island, to record it. And I've just written an essay about that in the TLS. And in due course, in undue course, in quieter, drier times, Barry and Sonia lost their daughter, then lost her again. As a baby first, Barry sounded the alarm when, returning to the house from his first floor studio over an archway by the mill, there was no sign of her. Distraught, had she somehow got out, fallen into the deep sluice channel of the old mill workings, drowned while they worked? He and Sonia, who had been hard at work herself, searched for hours before discovering that she had crawled upstairs, exhausted herself, was curled asleep under their bed. But then, as a girl, even after they'd fenced the garden, Anya was drawn to the water. She knew that's where she would find Barry when he wasn't painting. When he fished from the strip of land that led down to the weir 100 yards above the house, he had a bell he rang when he'd hooked a salmon to summon Sonia or Anya with net or tailor. She learned that if she wanted a father, she would need to have one on his terms, in his world. That bond between father, daughter, and fish grew in the months and years after he laid her out as a baby beside a salmon at least 3 times her length. Anya let me see Barry's fish book. It's full of confirming treasures. 4 pages full of the pictures Ted took on the day Nick caught that great queen on his mother's birthday. That's a pike. Pictures at Gur, too, of pike, one of Ted's delight as he weighed one by Anya of Barry and Ted, barber jacketed, leaning between boats, Ted's orange fiberglass deck, Barry's coracle, as they came together for lunch. Huge, sleek catches of tench, that stunning carra trout I mistook for a sea trout, the Sheelin monster, 5 1/4 pounds, that Barry had cased and started his desire for a specimen pike to match it. But the most moving is a picture captioned Anya, self, and 22-pounder in March 1972. The fish dwarfs her, the rope around its tail wrist level with her head. Barry is squatting, but the top of his head is missing. That's not the point. The point is her eyes. Wild, defiant, self-possessed, but possessed too by that giant fish. She's clutching a withy, a long branch, to rhyme with Barry's rod. Her own bond with Barry and the fish deepened, literally. Her father warmed to it, let her in. Through the 70s, Barry took her with him after Tench, Bream. He painted the Tench Lake, not his daughter. And was, Anya told me, in his studio, as her mother was in hers, when in her early teens, downstream on the river below Jerpoint, Spates brought trunks down and they wedged over the gap in another weir. She told me she'd go out, alone, unsupervised, tie a rope around the log, the other end around her waist, and plunge into the water with a homemade snorkel, 2 halves of a tennis ball, one mounted above a length of polythene tubing, the other sliding up it to provide the seal. So she could hang for as long as she could, beside the salmon, in the flow, breathe with them. Total immersion. Mad ingenuity? Or just practicing what her parents were preaching? In August 2016, I sent Anya my transcript of a letter I just read in Atlanta, where Barry's letters to Seamus and Ted are kept in a high library tower. It was from the year of that proud picture with the salmon, 1972. Barry was full of praise for what he'd read of Ted's work in Persia with Peter Brook. Ted had invented a new, visceral, primitive language of expression for the play they'd made together, August. Barry couldn't compete with that, but he had for 3 years been devising a system, an installation of valves and pumps to prove the identity of water and blood flow in river and body. Everything flows. It was more than metaphor. It was confluence of Barry's world of fish and water and Sonia's. And more besides. In the year that they'd moved to the island, 1965, the Steiner Press had published an English translation of a book by the German engineer and Steiner disciple, Theodor Schwenk, Das sensible Chaos, or sensitive chaos. The forms of water, above all its response to disturbance, the curls and back channels and reverse pressures and currents were, Schwenk argued, at the heart of all natural processes and spiritual, from river meander to fluency of thinking to the formation of organs, even bones. It added years of observation to an old Heraclitean truth that Barry painted on his studio wall at Jerpoint, then on the quay in Thomastown, in a studio he made from a handball alley, which he roofed in perspex. Everything flows. The closer you got to this truth, the more exactly you saw it, the more fully you understood the world and your place in it. Barry was excited in that letter. After working on it for 3 years, he said, with an engineering friend, a competition in Belfast gave them the chance to submit plans. Nothing came of it. Their pumps wouldn't work. They'd failed to understand the negative pressure, the backflow, that was as crucial to the way the heart's pump works as it is to the vortices which the water in a fast current makes when displaced by the gills of a trout, keep curling back, then forward, keeping them in the stream. Another disciple of Steiner, the forester Victor Schauberger, knew that, designed a trout turbine. But Anya told me she knew all about it as a girl. How could she not? And then the answer, after all these eddies and rapids and runs to my question. She said also, of course Ted and Barry discussed this. And Ted and Carol would have discussed it with her too. When she was old enough, or at least 9, Sonia and Barry sent her to a Steiner Waldorf school, which happened to be in Gloucestershire. She'd catch the train to Rosslare, the boat to Fishguard, the bus to Stroud at 9, and then spend the half terms at Court Green or in Moortown with Ted and Carol. Ted took her fishing and nature watching at dusks and dawns. She remembers him telling her, fishing is my way of breathing. Who better to understand that than this child of the island of water? I thought again of Ted's poem, Go Fishing, its imperatives. Join water, wade in underbeing, gulp river and gravity, lose words. I thought of its amazing imagining of fish that materialize in suspension, gulping, and dematerialize under the pressure of the eye. I'd always and only associated that with the rapt self-communion Ted found in fishing in the world of water, the intensity of his admiration for those 7 strangers, the sea trout, his concentration peering down on the bank, reaching for a state they achieved and held until he gave himself away. Those Sligo pike, contemplative, the sensitive predator he knew he could be too, disturbed at last by his lure. Now it gained a dimension. Its imperatives became an invitation Anya had accepted. I saw her roped in the Nor Gap, in the coiling currents of the cold, invigorated water, her homemade snorkel the only thing that stopped her gulping river, to be with the salmon. And I'm delighted to say that Anya's with us now. So follow that, young woman. Over to you, Anya.
Hi, Mark. Hi. Thanks to all of you. Yeah, you describe an exciting picture throughout all of your journeys and discoveries of Ted, of Barry, of fishing, your journey. Yeah, my meetings with Ted were, lifelong in a way, almost. I would visit him, as Marcus described, from a young child onwards, and also met him in the island and continued to meet him until just a few months before he died, and then was there at his funeral. He was such a great, gentle giant of a man, a being, humble, sensing observer of life's phenomena. Watching and sensing were his tools, I would say, to not only through his poetry live and explain art, life, fishing, but also to live it. I always found that in retrospect, and myself in the doing, I'll come back to being part of the water and maybe take a little bit of liberty and take parts of the Go Fishing poem to be myself with that as well. But he was so thoroughly imbued in a total immersion in what I call the phenomenological discipline of questioning, understanding, describing, experiencing. And I was very at home with him, with them in that. And Mark's described the pleasure that I had, but also the deep honor, of course, but the pleasure that I would have with Ted, especially in dawns and dusks. I think that magical in-between world was a world that he inhabited so easily. And I have to say they're my favorite times of day too. Fishing with Barry, Ted and Nick was a frequent experience, and on the one hand often terribly cold. I suffer the cold. But on the other, this total immersion into nature. Nick was totally obsessed, I would say, with fishing and catching was just the right thing. That level of obsession and need was not mine, but my level of need to, and still is, to commune and be part of nature in its watching, sensing, observational qualities are my nourishment, let's say. I'll not speak too long. That madness of me tying myself to a tree trunk was also total joy. It was for me to, I quote, join water, wade in under being, let brain mist into moist earth, ghost loosen away the downstream gulp river and gravity. And now I'll go on. Dissolved into earth wave, the soft sun shock dismembered in sun melt, become translucent, one untangling drift of water mesh, and a weight of earth taste light, mangled by wing shadows, everything circling and flowing, and hover still. This hovering still is what fish do. You know, one questions, do they exercise muscle to travel, or do they find that hovering still in the water to be carried by it? This hovering still is, I think, a tenet that this gentle giant of Ted inhabited. He could hover still in the experience of a human social setting, in the observation of watching nature around him, and also both he and Barry had an incredible ability to say, we've only got a few minutes on the phone, you know, a coin phone, this is before mobiles, saying, come and join us. This is when Barry was in Britain, and I was living there at the time, much later on. Come and join us. There's a beautiful patch, and we'll be fishing there this afternoon into the evening. And these very detailed descriptions of park your car by that and that tree, climb over the next gate, and then, these detailed observations that would get me to the place. And Ted always would sort of guffaw and sort of say, I knew she'd find us. And with that, to join them for a couple of hours and then maybe a meal later or whatever. A remarkable man and a remarkable participant in nature, but he also, as we all know from his poetry, so shares it with each and every one of us. Anyone who has the patience to just sit, stand, or whatever, just be in it and watch, sense it. No. Is there more that you'd like me to pick up on, Mark? Or
frankly, Anya, as I always think when I've been talking to you, you should have written this book, but that's fantastic. Thank you so much. I'm now going to read it towards the Kingfisher, and then I'm going to hand over to Malcolm when I've read towards that, if that's all right. The 6th of April, 1981, part of a great Irish month of fishing. And this interlude had begun on the Friday, a day of blue warmth. Only 5 miles or so upriver from Graignamanagh, 25 minutes from Barry and Sonia, but on the opposite slope of the valley from the Murphy's house as Giochbastine and another world. Their destination, the Barrow at Boris. Their hosts were the Kavanaghs, themselves old friends of Barry's. Andrew, Ted recognised. He'd seen him on TV before in a horse race. He offered them dinner that evening or lunch on Saturday. It was, Ted noticed, a giant house, colossal, and with the trappings of ancient wealth, but worn lightly, as lightly as Barry and Ted wore their own old Barber jackets. Tina Kavanagh led them inside, and it could have been a hard-nosed farmhouse, except for the family motto in Irish, the massive doors of fine walnut. Tina translated the motto, peace and plenty, and then gave them the unauthorised version, fucking and farting. She'd been brought up in Lincolnshire, but now only knew England through its racecourses. Ted was intrigued by her confidence, the talk that came from her like a swift river, confident-mannered over a substrate of what he knew was feeling, considerateness. He couldn't imagine such a combination in England. Then down to the river. Tina led the way through sheep-thronged parkland. Ted reunited lambs the wrong side of a fence with their mothers, down a rutted lane through ancient woodland, which must have required some care. They were pulling their boats, battered now, behind the van, to the broad brown Barrow, and left along the river to a small, rather grand sandstone arch bridge over a side stream, but itself the size of the Tor and notably clearer than the main river. Ted noticed kingfishers hurtling down this stream, out under the bridge, and into a wood on the far bank of the Barrow. Tina and her gaggle of children hung about a bit, then left them to it. Ted and Nick took their time. They fished till nightfall, then spent a steely cold first night in the van parked beside the bridge over that side stream they'd crossed just as they left the grandeur of the park. At Jerpoint, Ted's sleep had brought him dreams he needed to think about and to write. Now he dreamed of 3 bears, Alaskan or fairy tale. As he woke, Nick met him with another suggestion. Come on, you Himalayan honey bear, get up. Nick's Oxford zoologist friends remember his jars of court green honey. The Hugheses spent the morning trying a method that should have worked, easing their boat downstream between the weirs, behind naturally drifting dead baits under floats. Should have, it didn't. At midday, Ted left Nick to it. and went up for drinks. The Murphys, already old friends of the Kavanaghs, joined them, and lunch. Wine flowed as well as the talk about the Anti-Pollution Conservation Committee Andrew was on, and the need to inform farming practice with the latest research. Then, final proof of this ancient wealth. Not so much lightly worn this time as just, well, accreted. Andrew takes Ted down into their vast cellars. Ted admires the stalagmites, each a stringy foot long, each with a drip on its tip and helping in their way to control the damp. He notices chalkboards with cellarage details, some dating back to the early 1800s, and empty champagne bottles strewn everywhere. The stair down, too, he notes, is cluttered with rubbish. Then back to rejoin Nick, beside a river that, as night comes on and mist clings to its surface, keeps its secret, like some book they found much harder to read than its woodland banks. Broad, flat river we cut through to tonight, turning aside the pictures, turning the pages. Primroses, violets, milky maids, celandines, wooden enemies. In early April 2016, Roderick Murphy is driving me through massive stone gates and into the stable yard of Boris House. It's a day short of 35 years since that hot blue afternoon when Ted and Nick arrived here. Andrew and Tina give us tea in a kitchen of such proportions that the vast canvas over the dining table, one of Barry's of New Zealand, looked right at home. And then we're driving round past the 17th century crenellated confection of Boris House itself. Their son, Morgan, one of that throng of children back in 1981, has taken on the farm, more often than not when I've seen him, he's cheerfully mud-spattered, and the responsibilities that come with such an extraordinary place. Most of the house in Parkland, apart from a family wing, and including ballroom and family chapel, earn their keep as a venue for weddings, as they already were in 1981, Tina insists, when I mentioned Ted's diary. That explained all those empty champagne bottles. But those were in the days before websites. Now it makes commercial sense. Adds a personal grace note to those crenellations, and so the bookings, to mention the history responsible for that motto. The McMurrough Kavanaghs can trace their lineage right back to the kings of Leinster, the lost royal family of Ireland. Soon Tina was leaving me as she had led Ted and Nick past the chapel. We drove across that sheep-grazed parkland, grass as startlingly green, and then, abandoning the car, slithered down into rough woodland along the track that led past a large modern house by what she called the mountain stream. Salmon still run up it to spawn on the slopes of Mount Leinster, though in nothing like the numbers they once did. The water was startlingly clear. We left our cars there and walked downstream along a pitted overgrown track, dogs plunging into deep piles of dead leaves and charging up the hill after scents. Tina's talk did the same. But I also tried to listen to the water, keep one eye out, a faint hope. Amid all this chatter and dog crashing heartiness as we made our way down the stream, any self-respecting kingfisher would be holed up somewhere 3 pools away. But I brought the subject up anyway. I wanted to hear it from Tina herself. She couldn't remember exactly where it was, but she was definite. Ted had seen a kingfisher fly past and had said, "That's the first kingfisher I've ever seen." She remembered it particularly because the claim had surprised her, too. When do you see a kingfisher? What does it mean really to really actually see one? And how do you write about it when you have? It depends on your point of view, of course, and Ted couldn't have been better equipped, but he had competition. For the last 100 years or so, a single phrase of the Jesuit poet Gerard Manley Hopkins, writing from a seminary in the Vale of Clwyd in 1877, seems to pose the problem and answer it in a single breath. As kingfishers catch fire, dragonflies draw flame. And until that walk down the mountain stream with Tina and Roderick and the dogs, I'd never questioned the rightness of that insight. as swift as its moving target. All that most of us ever see of kingfishers, I suspect, is just that definitive traceable moment of spontaneous combustion, when light reflects off their astonishing blue-black backs in flight and scatters, attracts our attention, and then confounds it, slips out of our sight and into reflection, memory, analogy. It's crowning proof of how nature engages our senses, illuminating truths about the creatures we see, but then making us look again. In the after-image of iridescence's dazzle, other thoughts and feelings may spark. Physicists may wonder about the energy that organizes it wherever it lies in the fibers of the feather. Metaphysicists like Hopkins, who researched optics while a Jesuit novitiate, may see in the light show the God who fathers forth, whose beauty is without change. But I've come to see that in making kingfishers and dragonflies actors in this larger drama of flickering light and heat, as well as language, dazzling specimens of the one thing and the same that each mortal thing does, that is, selves, goes itself, Hopkins converts these predators into preyers, overlooks their prey that fuels their fire. The poet's vested interest is ingenious, determined. From a line that began in natural movement, he leads his readers through a series of perspectives and faces that take us to God the Father and back again. These past years of fishing on the Torrids, the Tamar and the Dart, or walking whenever I can at first light beside the fen lode that runs 100 yards from my house, I've come to learn that the sharp midshipman piping that cut through a conversation or a drifting silence could and should give me notice of a blue streak that there I was primed to see. But I had never actually seen a kingfisher fishing, let alone catch a fish. Tina's still talking this Saturday afternoon in April. Now we're getting close to its confluence of the Barrow. Tina's tumbling operatic performance holds centre stage, drowns out the murmur of the mountain stream. I keep my eyes cast to the right height as a pool on a bend gives way to a run of downstream rapids, and a kingfisher catches them, draws them with me. My attention comes to rest, as it does briefly, a matter of 2 seconds, on the lowest twig of a bush over a pocket of water at the foot of this run. It holds my eyes while there. It dips down, breaks the water, comes up again, then shoots, hurtles away towards the confluence with the Barrow, all before I can or want to say a word. I go back to Ted's poem, the one that Ted told Barry, who told Tina and Andrew, who told Roderick and Caroline and me, he'd written after his own conversation with Tina that Saturday afternoon. The kingfisher? I have nothing but Tina's memory of what Ted said to make me think so. But now I see it. It must have come to him quickly while he was in Ireland, a last call for a place in a primer of birds that his friend Leonard Baskin finished setting and printing that June. It's in good company. Ted had found other bird poems, The Rival about a cormorant, Whiteness about a heron, in Encounters at Dawn on the Torrids the previous September and May, consolations for when those other stiller strangers eluded him. Like a kingfisher, they found their way into River 2. The kingfisher is here now. It could suddenly be nowhere else. That raggle-taggle tumble-down river must be the mountain stream, charging past ancient wells so chaotically inhabited. But it's not just this river, it's what happens on it, the sequence of events, the studied perch, the bird's high-tech lens-assisted X-ray penetration of what even to a fisherman with polarizing, glare-busting glasses remains a tangle of glooms. The straight dash downstream through the light. He, and it is a single bird, a real fisherman, royal too, a capital fellow, kingfisher, beak full of ingots, leaves a rainbow splinter sticking in your eye. However fast or hard you look, neither language nor any human sense, hearing or vision can keep up. And you're not the only one. The oafish oaks seem to be looking in the wrong place too, for things they assume only to be stones. while he has lifted all its jewels, shivering the spine of the river. But there's more to the Kingfisher than this smash and grab raid. Ted's learned from Hopkins, from first to last, one of his favourite poets. He too wants to say more, slyly. Remember, Scion of Ireland's lost royal family has just shown him what lies in and beneath that old house, the gap between theory and practice on pollution, farmers whose practice lets them down, the easy chaos of old money, but what the ancient wealth sits on too, that amazing clutter of the Boris cellars, stalactites and champagne bottles. Now he spears this other spry royal of a bird. In The Kingfisher, fisherman Ted answers back to Hopkins, reverses the direction of light. Through him, God, whizzing in the sun, source of solar light sent tumbling, glimpses the angler. Through him, and whether him means the Kingfisher or angler doesn't matter, because as Ted once wrote, fishermen understand why Christ was said to be a fish. Fishermen worship water. God's in for a surprise. He has his nose rubbed in another kind of Genesis, the fishy mire few humans ever bring themselves to imagine. We're in the tunneled bankside burrow where life and death get churned, swallowed and shat out, once the spine of that glittering ingot, caught so expertly in the water of the mountain stream, has been snapped, its spark of life extinguished. What did Ted say about the stairs down to the Boris cellars, just inside the main door? It was as cluttered with rubbish as the wildest dump. Malcolm.
Well, thank you. I mean, that I think is a very beautiful reading of the poem itself, and a beautiful, as you do so often in this book, it's a kind of citing of the poem in a particular place, which doesn't restrict it, but kind of backlights it. It struck me that the question you ask, sort of in the middle of the passage that you read, which is, when do you see a kingfisher? What does it really mean to actually see one? Which is the kind of answer to the mystery that somehow on this moment Ted saw, not just the little glimpse, the bit of peripheral vision that we see, the flash, the glimmer, the light on the back. And we say, I saw a kingfisher, but we didn't. We saw the trace of one, the kind of the refraction of one. It's rather like what T.S. Eliot said about poetry itself. He said poetry is peripheral vision, but that the real art of the poet is to be still enough to woo the periphery in and see it. So I think your reading of the poem is right, but I think it is very much a poem, the actual Kingfisher poem itself, a poem about seeing. And you mentioned a reversing the flow. I think there's a real reversal going on, because it starts with us sort of seeing the kingfisher and to study, the kingfisher perches, he studies, escape from the jewelers. So we have the fisherman, the angler, looking from his own particular angle at the kingfisher perched, looking at the river. But then, Ted gives these amazing series of kind of embedded metaphors, all governed in a sense by the idea of the kingfisher as the jeweler, as the jeweler, has that jeweler's eye and the little lens on the jeweler's eye, which lets him see. And the jeweler's art is to cut the line, which releases the facet in the stone that allows us to see. And one of the things that's going on in this, so the spilling, when we get the kingfisher erupts through the mirror, a shower of prisms, a spilling armful of gems, beak full of ingots, and is away. This is the great cutting the one straight line of the raggle-taggle tumble-down river with a diamond. So you've got all the waviness of the river, and you've got this one straight line. And then Ted, does this one straight line. He, as you say, he reverses the flow. He leaves the rainbow splinter sticking in your eye. And then, as it were, the theology, as you know, I'm really intrigued by and drawn to the moments of a suddenly explicit theology in Ted. And it's not, of course, for me in my tradition, it's not a comfortable theology, but it's a real theology to which attention must be paid. It's a genuine disclosure. So through him, God, whizzing in the sun, glimpses the angler. That's an astonishing idea, as it were, that all the time you think the poem is about whether or not you can see a kingfisher. The concentration is on whether you can see and how you see and what you see and with what metaphors you see. And then suddenly in an instant, the reverse, it's a complete flow. You yourself are being gazed upon. You are being looked upon. And God is looking at you, as it were, from the light of the sun onto the kingfisher, then through the eye of the kingfisher in you. And then God is about this other business. There's this kind of, he takes one of the great, religious metaphors of the marriage of the sky and the earth, the bridegroom, all of that, and does this extraordinary thing. Through him, God marries a pit of fishy mire. That's a classic use of this. It's going down, the kingfisher's beak is now going down into the fish. And look, he's gone again, spark sapphire refracted beyond water. And this lovely, lovely, lovely line at the end, shivering the spine of the river. I mean, you and I have both glimpsed kingfishers, Mark, on the same river, in fact, and written to each other about that. And that extraordinary sense of that there's a kind of beneficence, there's a kind of blessing. You suddenly see everything you see more clearly, because for a minute you've seen that iridescent light. And Hopkins saw it, and Heaney, of course, saw it as well, when he spoke of the kingfisher's blue bolt at dusk, changing everything. But actually, to change it all and say, no, I've not only seen, but I have been seen. And then this lovely thing, shivering the spine of the river. It is, as we would say, just, resorting to cliche, a spine-tingling moment for us to see a kingfisher. Yeah. But the idea of the movement of the kingfisher itself as literally shivering the spine of the river, there's something astonishing going on that. Both the river is a living thing like us, and in some sense ourselves as the river. I think there's some relationship between this and Go Fish, and the way Ted, as it were, patiently allows, he noughts himself, he loses his identity, he loses his agency in being the separated observer and becomes part of the river itself in some sense. So in this poem, when we say our spine is tingled by the sudden sight of the kingfisher, then the river itself is the spine that is tingled, and we're in it. There's just a series of lightning quick, giddying shifts of perspective going on this poem that kind of reflect the sudden, quick movement of the kingfisher itself. And it's a poem to which I return a lot, because one of the experiences I suppose you have, and you've done this beautifully in that your prose account of your experience of this poem in place, is that the experience of the kingfisher is so quick, it's so fast and reflective and whizzing, as the word he used, and it's gone. So to go back patiently to it with the art of the poet and to make it happen again, and make it happen reliably each time you read the poem, that sense of, again, in Heaney's phrase, what happens next is undiminished for having happened once, twice, 10,000 times before. It's an astonishing gift, I think, this particular poem, to anybody that's ever had the experience and wanted in some way to recover a little of what it meant. Yeah. The poem is simply a gift that does that. But again, I think your reading of it has given us even more, as it were, to bring to it. And I thought your imaginary conversation, as it were, between Hughes and Hopkins over that was particularly helpful. So anyway, those are just some reflections on it, and with happy memories of sudden glimpses of kingfisher. I'm almost tempted to wonder whether there's also a bit of a Fisher King there, but we won't go there.
Well, Malcolm, thank you. You make me see things all that I should have written about, and in fact seen in that brilliantly. So it is, and I've had many conversations with Anya too about a couple of conversations vividly at home at Jerpoint and then on Zoom, and both of them it is, as you said, it's a poem that keeps glittering. So Martin is going to tell us the story of the salmon of knowledge. Martin, is that all right? And then we'll have a conversation if we can, if you've got stamina, and then Terry and I will close up. But I promise my last reading is short, and then it yields to Terry's climax. But Martin, in the first place, over to you.
Okay, thank you for that. Yeah, let's jump into a story. I'll read it because if I really start to tell it, it's like a concertina expanding and we'll be here forever. It's from this book, Cinderbiter, Old Irish Tales, that I wrote a few years ago with my friend, the late Tony Hoagland. And it circles round the magic of the salmon. So the young Finn McCool, the great bard and warrior of ancient Ireland, is making his way from a childhood basically on the run, and he's heading to Tara to claim his destiny. And when you get into that kind of trouble, at some way along the line, you're going to meet a mystic. And he ends up at the River Boyne, and he comes across an old man who's fishing called Finnegas. And I'll take it from there. He's filled with questions when he meets Finnegas, who is a brilliant, wise, and kind man. So Finn starts his questions. Why do you live by flowing water? Because a poem is a kind of revealing, and at the bank of running water, the poem is revealed to us. Well, how long have you been here? 7 years, said the man. A long time, whispered Finn. Oh, I would settle twice the distance for a good poem, smiled Finnegas. Have you caught good poems? What I was ready for has found me. You can't reach for more than that. Our readiness is our limit. Now, Finn, he just eats this stuff up. And the questions keep coming. The poems have been even greater by the majestic Shannon or the Liffey. Well, they're good rivers too, of which you speak, but they belong to different gods. The elder man leaned forward. A man of foresight did predict that I would catch the salmon of knowledge in the Boyne waters. This would in turn give me all knowledge. Well, what would you do with it? Asked Finn. That's a question with horns, lad. What would you do? I think I would make a poem, cried Finn. I think, spoke Finnegas, I think that is what would happen. So from then on, Finn jumps into an apprenticeship with the older man, but for various reasons hides his name. The man doesn't know he's Finn. He thinks he's called Demney. And the questions continue. They're gorgeous questions, bardic questions, Olav questions. How does the salmon get wisdom into its flesh? Not hard to answer, told Finnegas. Overhanging a secret pool, there is a hazel bush. Its ripe seeds drop from bush to pool, and the salmon eats them. Flushed, the boy spoke. Could we not just track the sacred hazel and eat them ourselves? Oh no. Such a bush could be discovered only by eating the seeds, those very seeds that can only be found by eating the salmon. Finn writhed, then wrestled out his patience, like all good anglers. They must wait for the salmon. Now one day, Finnegas came to where Finn sat, a basket on his arm, both spring and winter in his expression. What is the matter, master? Inquired Finn. Look in the basket, lad. Finn gazed into the basket. Oh, it's a salmon, sighed Finnegas. It is the salmon. I wish you to roast it for me as I take a short walk to gather myself. Well, Finn cooked as never before, smoked on a wooden platter, the fish nestled between green leaves, a delirium of scent. Finnegas returned for his high moment, and his eyes scanned his student tenderly. Did you not take just a little bit for yourself? I left so you may eat the fish, if so compelled. And the boy spoke, proud and wounded. Why would I take another man's fish? Well, Youth rides the red horse of desire, spoke the poet, and even a taste constitutes its eating. At this, Finn smiled. Well, you know, it's funny you should ask. By chance, I may have got the merest flavour, because there was a blister on my skin, not suitable for my chef's eyes. So I pressed down with my thumb, and I placed that thumb in the cave of my mouth to cool the smart. The old man winced just a little. My love, tell me your name. My name is Demna, as I have said before. Your name is not Demna. Your name is Finn. Finn was startled, knocked off his perch. How could you know this without tasting the salmon, he asked. In that prediction of my catching the salmon, it was said that it would be eaten by Finn. Tears pricked the eyes of the young hero. No, 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 no. You shall have half this fish with me here and now. The bard trembled and stood back. No bone, no skin, no flesh I shall eat. This feast is yours, as I leave libation to the mossy gods of the underworld and the forces of the air. So Finn sat, and he ate the salmon of knowledge, his master watching in the half light. And when it was done, a great tranquility swept into the frame of old Finnegas. It was quite the battle with that fish, he spoke. Finn said, did it give good account for its life? It did, but that is not the battle I'm talking about. The two men cleaned up and made a fire. They drank tea and they sat out under 100,000 stars.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Martin.
Yes, and before I shoot off, it's a beautiful thing you've done, Mark. It's a beautiful thing you've done. There's a melancholy in the book, but in the best sense of it, and it moves between time signatures and it moves between different rivers. And the fact that you had the courage to track the story of you and your father is phenomenally moving. And God bless you for that.
Thank you very much. And thank you for hanging on. I'm sorry to have overrun, but that was wonderful, Martin. I really appreciate it. I'm sure we all do. Thank you. Now, can people stay on a bit longer? Because if anyone has questions, Steve has written one, and then he will at least hear the answer to it in recording. But feel free to fire away. Yes. Was it ever going to be a plan to be a more conventional monograph? Well, I tried really hard to achieve a kind of scholarly dryness or objectivity, and I just couldn't. I kept having the most fantastic time, often, as we'll hear right at the end, with Terry, but with others too, the friends I made. But I think more importantly, my obsession with tracking where Ted fished suddenly made me realize that obsession had suppressed a memory, or what I thought was a memory, about where I began fishing, as Kate said, at the age of 4. And having tracked down the shrunken mid-fairway mudslick of Crook Hill Pond, 3 days after I stopped doing a very big, relatively big, if not important, administrative job in Cambridge that I'd done for 20 years, I took myself off back to this pond and discovered that it was still there, discovered as I did so that all my elder brothers had different memories of it. And that led one way or another, first to me catching fish that I thought the pond didn't hold, and then to starting talking to my brothers about our father who took us fishing and rediscovering photographs about them. And actually only when I did that trip and caught those fish from that pond, I came back and just wrote longhand. And I knew that that's what I needed to do and not suppress anymore. And I discovered bizarrely that I had suppressed any recognition of the fact that my dad was born within 18 months and 10 miles of where Ted was born, and they were both cremated in the same crematorium in Exeter. And I couldn't, once I'd recognized that, I couldn't do anything other than go with it, really. So that's I hope that's not too long an answer. But this is from the last chapter of the book. And it began as a day after a Ted Hughes weekend in Dunregan, which is the house that Ted and Assia and the kids had lived in for 6 weeks in 1966, which is now extended and owned by a wonderful couple called Robert and Anne Jocelyn. And it's in Connemara, the most stunning part of Ireland, really magnificent. And the day after this conference, Terry and Neil and I went on the Connemara loop. And the bit I'm going to read comes right at the end of that day, but not at the end quite of the book. We headed back. It was gone 10 p.m, which almost is now, isn't it? But this was an Irish summer. Dusk was only now beginning to thicken, and my appetite for revelations was still sharp. So, Deirdre Madden's recommendation having turned out so marvellously, which was to discover Oscar Wilde's fishing lodge, which we found, I now recalled what her husband, the poet Harry Clifton, had told me. On their way to Dunregan, they'd said, they'd stopped to watch a netsman at his surreptitious work, but seen an otter waiting just beyond the net for any fish he missed. That was at dusk too, at high tide. So having crossed the humped bridge over the Owen Moor at Toombeola, I pulled into the disused petrol station forecourt above the river as it eased out into its own small bay. We walked back onto the bridge, looked upstream. The river widened and in 50 yards or so made a leisurely bend inland. Across it flexed what I at first thought was the net, but realised was instead a length of black polythene pipe, the lower boundary of the Ballynahinch Castle fishing, I guessed. And then Terry pointed, hissed, "Mark, an otter!" He pointed down, just below the parapet. That's what Harry had told us to look for. And yes, there was a head in the water. Then nothing. And then 3-4 seconds later, a head broke surface 10 feet to the left, out in midstream. And then a second after, in by the bank. Could that possibly be the same animal? Speed of light shapeshifter? These weren't dark furred heads, though. That otter in the bridge pool at Grimmaster, and then that pair on the Tamar, there's no mistaking them. But then now, again and again, all over the river within seconds, snouts were breaking the surface, and then dorsal fins and backs and tails wriggling easily, dark water grey, flashing silver as they did so. Salmon! A pod! At least a dozen of them, just in off the tide, which sheer luck had brought us to the bridge to witness, reacting to their first fresh water since last year at least. None less than 4 pounds in weight, I guessed, some much larger. It was like watching a family on an outing, or as I watched them from above, jostling, easing alongside each other, frisking, like a herd of sleek elephants or dolphins. Were they all feeling this return for the first time? Or were some old hands leading the way? I was too inexpert and the light too thick now for me to be sure. By now, the cup of this day was well above the brim. To see this quiet, murmuring, nudging, gentle form of what at Ashley we'd seen in all its fury falls with the salmon leaping. The working out of a purpose between salt and fresh, water and air, sea and river, self and the turning inward and onward of the urge to reproduce, return home. This shoal fresh from the tide, skittish, colts, bullocks, but relishing the fresh water, getting used to it, anadromous, too little pressure on their organs suddenly, the water lighter, less concentrated after the sea. And all of this within sudden reach. It'd be a good moment to fish for them, said Terry. And of course he's right. This resolute champion of the green, this friendly antagonist who had written to Ted in 1994, asking him whether he could justify the pain he caused to fish. It hadn't entered my head, but now that I check, there's no sign there, no private fishing. And if that really is the bottom of the Ballinahinch fishery, I take my smuggler from the car boot in a minute and have slipped over the parapet of the bridge and between gorse bushes in another. I slot it together, thread line through the rings, select a fly, one of Robert's, and the line is looping out gently over the water, and I'm among them, swirling, moving yards away. I'm standing well back, crouching, working line out, twitching it back and then stripping and really wondering, in wonder at not frustration, why they're not taking. It would be just too easy. But then remembering what I'd at some point in the day been telling Terry of their diet at sea. So I draw in my line, snip off Robert's fly, and replace it with a cartoon shrimp. Remember Ted on the Torridge that morning. Moisten, try and test the half-blood knot so that it really holds. Then send out line, first inching it, then more firmly, rhythmically, and a touch, a brush, a murmur, and at last, one is on. And the fish leaps, and I know if I land it, I won't kill it. I'm a catch and release poacher, a purist, and I play it from the hand, not the reel, and loops of line slip from my fingers, and the fish comes towards me, and it's gone. Every cast then, for 8 or 10, my line miraculously gentle for a change. The loops I make deft, easy, searching. Every cast finds them, brings murmurs and swirls and brief contact in the fading light with a family group now inevitably moving upstream. Whether they've been spooked by what one has just told them, chemically, of the sharp shrimp, I can't know, but Ted might. And then the puckering and skirls and swirls and fin dart movements cease. My line feels lonely searching an empty river, and Terry, looking up from his notebook, tells me they're gone. I say, it's over. And he says, no, it's not, from the bridge, smiling, gesturing at his pad, his pen, his head. And he's right. It's just changed elements, moved into words.
A shoaling at Tumbiola Bridge. They came marauding up with the tide, under the bridge, between salt and fresh water, gathering themselves in the greatness of their condition, remembering this shadowed place, this taste, those far skylarks, this dark entry to the birthplace, the old underworld, to be their gravelled graves. Between peat banks, their decompression chamber is a river risen by recent rains in the big bends, where they wimple their fins on the water surface in silver flashes of strength for the falls ahead. Fat from the sea, beyond feeding now, feeling that thrust upstream that powered them past the nets in the neck of the bay, and around foul plugs from the pipes of white shoreline homes, towards the leaks and overflows of small farms they must outrun, and hopeful rods tempting with the flick of a handmade fly. Now they shoal at dusk, under the fading furnace of the West.
Oh, thank you, Terry. That's an amazing note to end on. And thank you, Mark. Those salmon were amazing to end on as well. Thank you so much.
Mark, can I ask you a question that I've been wanting to ask you? Towards the end of the book, you make some parallels between Ted's character and the salmon, and it seems to be deliberately placed towards the end of the narrative as some sort of climactic inspiration and insight. Can you just say a little bit more about what you were after there?
Well, I think in part, if I'm thinking of what happened to River, which began structured around the year, the wheel of the year, but actually changed so that it began with salmon eggs and ended, I think, with an October salmon, but I'm now going to get that wrong. I just had the sense that the salmon, in its journey, and its kind of heroic, against all odds journey upriver, fasting towards spawning and death, that came to coincide and moved forward and moved Ted in that poem October Salmon more profoundly than any other poem I've ever heard read by any other poet, even Malcolm and even Martin and even Terry. And there is a particular recording which, Terry, you've heard, and which actually closed the Salmon Conference that Kate referred to earlier, of Ted reading in a tiny sound booth. And I know what tiny sound booths are like now, having read the audiobook. And it's just murmured to himself, and it's inspired by the loss of his father, the fading of his father, and it coincides with that. And as it happens, my fishing with Chris, my eldest brother, whom we've kind of we've reconnected with each other through the writing of this book and the years I've spent writing it, and it's been wonderful. But we found ourselves fishing a long planned trip on the River Torridge in the summer that my dad was fading in hospital. And we saw one day fishing the Torridge, a salmon which had got fungoid growth on its head, an old salmon that was just barely moving. And that we saw that and we both saw it. We fished upstream at Elm Tree Run at Beam, where Tarka was born. Henry Williamson's Tarka was born, and we saw the same fish, and it was not interested in our fly. I know that Ted tried to, and did succeeded, in fact, in foul hooking a salmon that he saw in that same stretch of water in 1981, I think, because he knew it was going to die and not make it to spawn. We saw that within a fortnight or so of my father dying in Exeter Hospital. And the coincidence of Ted using the salmon as a lens to see himself and everything he valued in the world, and to see the salmon as a totem of sexual creation and of creation, and of a kind of pursuit in favor of the species at the expense of the self. That seemed, and then coinciding simply, and it did coincide with the death of my father. I couldn't not see those parallels. Sorry, that's a bit of a rambling answer, but that's why.
No,
there was a kind of.
That's interesting. Whilst we were waiting to begin, I found myself reading Ted's letter to Nicholas, at the end of his life.
Yeah.
And what you're describing as this kind of pushing through of the salmon towards some kind of conclusive journey is summed up in that letter when he says, what I thought all along was the big blockage. Once I'd actually released birthday letters, I discovered to have been no blockage at all. And it's like pushing through to make a discovery at the very end of his life. And what you've just been saying has made me think differently about the project of birthday letters, really.
Oh, well, good. Well, thank you. There's Anya had her hand up.
Just unmute myself. Maybe that I just enter in here. I mean, Mark, you describe your journey in relationship to your father and Ted and fishing and so on. Maybe I can just speak into why the salmon of wisdom, and Ted's absolute concern for ecology and his constant observation of it too. And Nick then inhabiting that in becoming a marine zoologist. I so see the two together. The salmon is sort of the essence of fishness. They're out in salt water, they come into fresh water, they do that enormous journey time and time again. and is coming back to their place of birth to spawn again. And somehow this existential quality, this existential need for survival, procreation, beauty, traveling, is that also of art? You know, as an artist, there's this existential need to reveal truths. And I sort of sense for Ted, and maybe hopefully for all of us, the salmon is in a way a litmus to this ecological health. And I think Ted really recognized that, as did Nick, and they shared some wonderful moments together in expressing and experiencing that. But I feel that the salmon is an expression of that artness, being art, and having that existential need for art. And the salmon expresses it in our ecological health and unhealth that sadly the latter we are now having to witness. Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you.
Anya, that was really moving. Thank you. David Day, do you have your hand up?
I mean, one of the things which I've found so pleasurable and exciting is this constant reminder that Hughes is a visionary poet. And I won't go on too long about it, but I've kept thinking of a passage by Traherne, where he says the corn was orient and immortal wheat, which never should be reaped, nor was ever sown. I thought it had stood from everlasting to everlasting. And that everlasting to everlasting is something that I think has been coming through in the readings and the glosses on the poems.
Was it Leonard? Now, I think, David, well, thank you for that. I think Leonard Skijai, if I'm pronounced, but Terry knows him better than I only know his work, but you knew him. I think he said that he regarded River as a kind of religious text, as a transcendent text. And you can, I think, I
play about that, and so does Keith Sagar as well.
Yeah.
And they use the word redemptive about it, don't they?
They do.
And I think in a way they want to place it as the sort of climactic text of the life. I don't think that quite works, because I think there are other elements that have to be brought into play that aren't in River. Would you agree?
I think there are elements there in different proportion in other texts. I mean, I was just really struck quite early in this, and it's been a long time. I mean, I say the writing of it, not this evening, which has almost been as long. But I went to listen to Simon Armitage in conversation with Max Porter, and they both, more or less independently, discovered that River was the most important and their favourite of Hughes's collections. Mm-hmm. But I would honour anyone who disagrees with that, because there is stiff competition, I think. And actually, having been scared of and avoided crow and cave birds for a long time, the 20,000 words or so of notes I wrote in advance of the Crow at 50 seminar, and Marina is here, and Kate, of course, too. I convinced me of Crow's claims, but then let's say, and having the discussion of cave birds convinced me of its claims too. I mean, I think there is serious competition, but I do think River has something, I think, directly drawn from the life as well as being mythic. I mean, that's the point about the fishing diaries. Ted talked about this, having this moral need to do justice, kind of concrete justice to the people and situations that the poems began in. And I don't quite see apart from birthday letters, obviously, I don't quite see the directness of drawing and conversion of wonderful poems from the life in other poems that I do, collections that I do in River. No, that's not true, because of course there's Moortown, those diary poems. Oh, Jenny, hi. Hello, Jenny.
Hello. Thank you so much, Mark. I can't wait to read the book in its entirety. And this is speaking as someone who's by no means a kind of Hughes expert, but as somebody who does spend quite a lot of time at the moment walking by the River Dart. So not quite the same area in Devon, but there are some similarities. And I just rereading Go Fishing. The image of the White Hospital is something that I'm going to kind of go away and have a look at. But I wondered how images like that for me sort of really intrude on the natural world in the kind of world of Go Fishing and in River as a whole. How you kind of saw that interplay in River and in your book as well, between the escape of nature, the kind of healing power of the river and of fishing versus the kind of stark white reality of the hospital world. I don't quite know where I'm kind of going with it, but I think that's it really. Yeah, the White Hospital always jumps out as me as something that is kind of quite contrast to the green and blue world of the river.
Well, it is. Yeah, I mean, I think. Well, I know Ted knew that humans have a responsibility for managing, either for curing or poisoning, and Aoine has mentioned this, the real deep life of water and its creatures. And hospitals are where, a white hospital is where my father died, in a ward named for one of Devon's rivers. The Royal Devon and Exeter, all the geriatric wards seem to be named for Devon's rivers. Perhaps it's more broad than that. But I think he knew, as a farmer, he knew the damage that pesticides and fertilizer and abstraction were doing to waters and river systems that, if left alone, would look after themselves and recover rapidly. And in preparation for the next conference that John Fanshawe and I are helping Salmon and Trout Conservation organise, again inspired by Ted's phrase, owned by everyone, because they should be, on chalk streams, I had a conversation, really extraordinary conversation, and Aoine might be interested in this, given what she's just been saying, with a guy who runs who manages the countryside estate at Mottisfont Abbey on the River Test, which empties into Southampton Water near the Isle of Wight, which is a really, really busy sea lane. During the first lockdown, Southampton Water was remarkably quiet. And I think there's an amazing film narrated by David Attenborough, and most amazing films need to be directed, called The Year the Earth Stood Still, I think, about the way that the Earth... But this was an example of it. Salmon numbers have been in pretty steady decline for the last 20 or 30 years. During that year of no marine traffic, more or less, quiet oceans, 5 times as many salmon came into the Test to spawn as had been seen for more 20 years. And so I'm a bit rambling, but I think Hughes was fascinated. In his fascination with another subject personally written into him, war and battle, because of his father, in the tension between a nurturing husbandry, whether the kind of enlightened farmers practice or that environmentalists can show to our natural world, and the devastation that we can bring on it. And, we see white hospitals being, in Syria and in the Ukraine. These are ambivalent, sites anyway.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, sorry, that's a bit rambling.
No, that's perfect. Thank you.
Thank you. Nice to see you.
Thank you so much for that beautiful question. And Mark, thank you. Guy Better, do you have a hand up?
Yes, I do. I do have a hand up. Let me lower it then. Yes, there we are. That's really interesting, Jenny, because I wrote down straight away about the hospital. I'd completely forgotten about that. And I would say this, wouldn't I? But I think it comes from the Stones, Sylvia Plath's Stones, which Hughes really admired. And I think at the end of Go Fishing, the hospital is actually, it is an ambivalent image. And I think it's let the world come back, busy with urgency words. And I think it's a really, it's almost like having had the vision, we have to return to the world. And certainly the Stones is exactly that the patient wakes up in the hospital and is dragged back into life. And Plath finishes it, of course, with love is the uniform of my bald nurse. Love is the sinew. Love is the curse.
Mm.
So it's everything, you know.
Fantastic. Thanks, Di, very much. Well, and Jenny too for provoking that. Brilliant. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, Di. That's fascinating. I'm going to go and have to reread that now as well.
I think we should. Yeah. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you so much.
Okay,
Thank you
all
so
right.
much, Mark.
Thank you. My pleasure. Thank you all panelists and you, Kate, for chairing. So thank you very much.